Quincy Xavier squinted through the haze of dust as he rode into Rattlesnake Gulch, his mood as sour as weak old milk. The year was 1876, and the Montana Territory was as unforgiving as the memories that haunted him. His saddle creaked beneath him, a constant reminder that even the most reliable things in life eventually wore down. "Damnation," he muttered, feeling the leather give slightly beneath him. The old saddle had been his father's, one of the few possessions Quincy had bothered keeping after the man passed. 3 weeks on the trail had worn it down something fierce, and now the horn was hanging by mere threads of stitching. He'd have to fix it before heading out again, which meant another delay he couldn't afford. At 32, Quincy had spent most of his adult life avoiding two things: attachments and women. Both had brought him nothing but trouble. His mother had abandoned the family when he was 10, running off with a snake oil salesman. His fiancée, Violet, had disappeared the night before their wedding 5 years ago, taking his grandmother's ring and the modest savings he'd accumulated. Since then, he'd kept to himself, working as a cattle driver and occasional bounty hunter, trusting only his horse, a reliable chestnut gelding named Copper, and his Colt revolver. Quincy dismounted outside the general store, wincing at the pain in his right knee. An old injury from a cattle drive gone wrong that liked to remind him of his mortality, especially after long rides. He looped Copper's reins around the hitching post, patted the horse's neck, and headed into the store. The bell above the door jangled as he entered, announcing his presence to the elderly shopkeeper who regarded him with indifference. Quincy nodded politely and moved toward the back where leather goods and tools were kept. He'd need awl and waxed thread to repair the saddle, maybe some new leather strips if the damage was worse than he thought. "Just passing through?" the shopkeeper asked, eyeing Quincy's dusty appearance, aiming to. "Need to repair my saddle first," Quincy replied curtly, selecting the items he needed. "Might want to check with Hammond, the livery owner," the old man suggested. "He does decent leather work when he's sober, which ain't often these days." Quincy shook his head. "I'll manage it myself." The shopkeeper shrugged. "Suit yourself, though you might consider waiting until morning. There's rumors of Blackfoot braves causing trouble on the North Road." "Appreciate the warning," Quincy said, laying coins on the counter. He had no intention of waiting. The sooner he delivered his message to the ranch owner in Eagle Pass, the sooner he'd get paid. Besides, he'd learned long ago that rumors in small towns grew faster than weeds after rain. With his supplies purchased, Quincy headed back to Copper. The street had grown busier in the short time he'd been inside. A stagecoach had arrived, disgorging weary passengers who stumbled toward the hotel. A group of cowboys lounged outside the saloon, passing a bottle between them and casting looks at two women who hurried past with baskets of laundry. Quincy untied Copper and led him toward an empty stretch of shade near the blacksmith's. He'd need space to work on the saddle, and the area looked quiet enough. As he approached, he noticed a wagon parked nearby, its contents covered with canvas. A young bay mare was hitched to it, munching contentedly from a feed bag. He removed his saddle from Copper's back, grunting at its weight, and placed it on the ground. The damage was worse than he'd thought. The stitching along the entire left side had come undone, and the horn was barely attached. It would take hours to fix properly. "Damn women," he muttered under his breath, thinking of how his mother's abandonment had forced him to learn such skills in the first place. His father, lost in grief and whiskey, had been useless when it came to practical matters. At 10 years old, Quincy had taken over mending clothes, cooking meals, and eventually repairing tack. The sound of footsteps made him look up. A woman approached, her arms full of packages from the general store. She was tall and slender, dressed practically in a simple blue skirt and white blouse, with a wide-brimmed hat shading her face from the afternoon sun. Quincy gave her a cursory glance, then returned his attention to his saddle. He had no interest in small talk, especially with a woman. The woman paused near the wagon, setting her packages inside before turning toward her horse. That's when she noticed Quincy and his damaged saddle. "That looks like it needs more than a simple stitch," she said, her voice carrying a slight Eastern accent. Quincy didn't look up. "It'll hold." He heard her footsteps coming closer but kept his eyes on his work, hoping she'd take the hint and leave him be. "You're going to need to reinforce that horn or it'll come off again within a day's ride," she continued, undeterred by his curtness. "I've been repairing saddles since before I could properly shave, madam," he replied, irritation edging his voice. "I appreciate your concern, but I don't need advice." There was a moment of silence, and Quincy thought with relief that she'd finally taken the hint. Then a shadow fell over him as she moved between him and the sun. "I'm Willa Everhart," she said, "and you're doing it wrong." Quincy looked up then, ready to deliver a sharp retort, but the words died in his throat. Willa Everhart had the most arresting eyes he'd ever seen, a clear, deep blue that reminded him of mountain lakes. Her face was lightly freckled, her brown hair escaping in tendrils from beneath her hat. She was older than he'd initially thought, perhaps in her late 20s, with a quiet confidence that was surprisingly unnerving. "Quincy Xavier," he replied automatically, then frowned at himself for responding at all. "And I've been riding since I was 6. I know how to fix a saddle." "I'm sure you do," Willa said with a slight smile, "but I grew up in my father's harness shop in Boston. I've repaired more saddles than you've likely owned." Without waiting for permission, she knelt beside him and ran her fingers along the damaged seams. "See here. The leather's worn through completely. You'll need to patch it before stitching or it'll just tear again." Quincy stiffened. "I don't recall asking for help, Miss Everhart." "Mrs.," she corrected, seemingly unaffected by his rudeness. "And no, you didn't. But I'd hate to hear about a man getting stranded because his saddle fell apart under him." She stood and dusted off her hands. "I have proper tools in my wagon. Wait here." Before Quincy could protest further, Willa had walked back to her wagon and was rummaging through a wooden chest. He considered simply taking his saddle and moving elsewhere, but something curiosity perhaps kept him rooted to the spot. Willa returned with a leather worker's kit far more comprehensive than the simple supplies Quincy had purchased. Without asking permission, she settled beside him and began examining the saddle more thoroughly. "This is fine craftsmanship," she observed, running her fingers along the cantle. "Older style, but quality work. Your father's—" Quincy nodded reluctantly, surprised by her accurate assessment. "Thought so. The stitching pattern is from the 40s, before the war." She looked up at him, those blue eyes assessing. "A saddle like this deserves proper repair, not just a quick fix." Despite himself, Quincy felt a grudging respect beginning to form. "And I suppose you're offering to show me how it's done." "I'm offering to do it for you," she replied, already selecting tools from her kit. "I haven't worked with good leather like this in months, and I miss it." "Why would you help a stranger?" Quincy asked, suspicious of her motives. In his experience, people rarely did things without expecting something in return. Willa shrugged. "Consider it professional pride. I can't walk past a beautiful saddle being butchered." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Besides, you look like you've had a hard journey. A few hours of rest while I work won't hurt you." Quincy wanted to refuse, to insist on doing the job himself, but the truth was, her tools were better, and her confident handling of the leather suggested she knew what she was doing. His knee was throbbing, and the prospect of sitting in the shade rather than hunching over detailed work was appealing. "Fine," he conceded grudgingly, "but I'll pay you for your time." Willa waved away his offer. "Keep your money. Just water my mare while I work, and we'll call it even." Quincy nodded, relieved to have something to do that wouldn't make him feel completely useless. As he filled a bucket from the nearby trough for Willa's horse, he found himself watching her work. Her movements were precise and efficient, her slender fingers moving with practiced ease as she assessed the damage to his saddle. "You mentioned a harness shop in Boston," Quincy said, returning with the water for her mare. "Long way from Montana territory." Willa nodded, not looking up from her work. Life takes unexpected turns sometimes. Her tone discouraged further questions, and Quincy respected that. Everyone in the West carried secrets or sorrows they didn't care to share. He settled against a nearby post, stretching out his bad leg, and watched as she began removing the damaged stitching with a small, sharp knife. "How'd you hurt your knee?" she asked after a while, surprising him with the observation. "Cattle stampede 3 years back," he replied. Got caught between a steer and a ravine. Knee hasn't been the same since. Willa nodded thoughtfully. My husband had a similar injury, buffalo hunt gone wrong. Husband, of course. Women like Willa Everhart capable composed, striking didn't travel alone in these territories unless forced by circumstance. He traveling with you? Quincy asked, glancing around despite himself. He died, she said simply, her eyes never leaving her work. 2 years ago, fever took him. I'm sorry, Quincy said awkwardly, unused to such conversations. Thank you. She looked up briefly, offering a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I'm heading to my brother's ranch near Eagle Pass. He's been asking me to come since Thomas died, and I finally decided it was time for a change. Quincy straightened. Eagle Pass, that's where I'm headed, delivering a message to Abraham Johnson at the Crescent Moon Ranch. Abe Johnson, Willa's eyebrows rose. That's my brother's neighbor. They've been feuding over water rights for months now. Small world, Quincy muttered, wondering if this coincidence would complicate his job. The message he carried was from Johnson's brother in St. Louis, something about selling the ranch. If Johnson's neighbor was involved in a dispute, it might affect the sale. What's your brother's name? He asked. Robert Everhart. He owns the Diamondback Ranch. Willa set aside her knife and threaded a large needle with wax thread. He's a good man, but stubborn as they come. This water dispute has him acting foolishly. Quincy nodded noncommittally. He'd learned long ago not to take sides in local conflicts until he understood all angles. Besides, his job was simply to deliver a message, collect his fee, and move on. Whatever happened between Johnson and Everhart wasn't his concern. They lapsed into silence as Willa worked. Quincy found himself oddly comfortable with her quiet presence. Most women he'd encountered in recent years had wanted something from him: his attention, his protection, his money. Willa seemed content to focus on her task, asking nothing more than the occasional help holding leather in place while she stitched. As the afternoon wore on, Quincy became increasingly impressed with her skill. Her stitches were neat and even stronger than any he could have managed. She'd reinforced the horn with an extra layer of leather she'd produced from her supplies and was now adding decorative touches that matched the saddle's original pattern. Where'd you learn to do that? He asked as she worked a complex design into the leather. My father, she replied, a genuine smile warming her face at the memory. He apprenticed under one of Boston's finest saddlers. I started helping in his shop when I was 7, much to my mother's dismay. She thought it unladylike. Willa tied off a stitch with practiced ease. By the time I was 16, I was doing most of the detailed work. Father's eyes weren't what they used to be. How'd you end up out west? I met Thomas at my father's shop. He was buying supplies before heading to Montana to start ranching with friends. He came back 3 times for additional supplies before finally working up the courage to ask me to dinner. Her expression softened at the memory. We were married 6 months later, and I followed him west. My father gave us a wagon full of leather working tools as a wedding present. Quincy nodded, understanding the value of such a gift. Quality tools were hard to come by in the territories. And you? Willa asked, glancing up. What brings a lone rider to these parts? Quincy hesitated, unused to sharing his business. But Willa had been forthcoming with him, and fairness demanded reciprocity. I work as a messenger mostly, sometimes as security for stagecoaches or wealthy travelers. Odd jobs to keep moving, Willa repeated thoughtfully. Running to something or from something, Mr. Xavier. Her perceptiveness was unsettling. Just Quincy, he corrected, avoiding the question, and I prefer the open trail to settling down. Because of the woman who hurt you, she asked directly, her hands never pausing in their work. Quincy stiffened. What makes you think men who avoid women as obviously as you do have usually been badly burned? Willa interrupted calmly. I've been on the trail for 3 weeks, Mr. Xavier. I recognize the signs when a man would rather face a rattlesnake than make conversation with a woman. Quincy felt exposed, as if she'd peeled back his carefully constructed armor with the same precision she'd used on his saddle. He considered denying it, but what was the point? After tomorrow, they'd likely never cross paths again. Her name was Violet, he said finally. We were to be married. She left the night before our wedding, took what little savings I had. Willa nodded, her expression free of the pity he despised. That would do it, she said simply. Though judging one woman by another's actions is like blaming all horses for one that threw you. Maybe, Quincy conceded. But it's safer that way. Safer, perhaps, but lonelier too. Before Quincy could respond, they were interrupted by shouts from the main street. A group of cowboys was gathered outside the saloon, their voices raised in what sounded like an argument. Quincy instinctively moved his hand to his sidearm, years of caution making him alert to potential trouble. Willa glanced toward the commotion, then returned to her work. Saturday afternoon in a trail town, she commented. Someone's had too much whiskey and too little sense. Her calmness surprised him. Most women he'd known would have been nervously seeking shelter at the first sign of trouble. Willa continued stitching as if drunken cowboys were no more concerning than flies buzzing around. The argument escalated, and the sound of breaking glass suggested someone had been thrown through the saloon window. Quincy stood, his hand still near his gun. You might want to move inside the blacksmith's, he suggested to Willa. She tied off another stitch before looking up. Is that what you'd advise any traveler, or just me because I'm a woman? Quincy frowned. It's common sense. That fight could spill this way. I grew up with 5 brothers, traveled with my husband through mining camps, and have been on my own for 2 years, Willa replied, her tone matter-of-fact rather than defensive. I've seen my share of brawls, but if it makes you feel better to stand guard, don't let me stop you. Quincy felt a mixture of irritation and reluctant respect. Most women he'd encountered in his travels either panicked at the first sign of trouble or expected men to shield them from all unpleasantness. Willa's practical attitude was refreshing, if somewhat vexing to his ingrained sense of chivalry. The fight didn't end up spreading their way. After a few minutes of shouting and the unmistakable sound of fists connecting with flesh, the town marshal appeared to break things up. The street gradually quieted, returning to its previous languid afternoon rhythm. Quincy relaxed his vigilant stance and sat back down, noting that Willa had made significant progress on the saddle. The main tiers were repaired, the horn was firmly reattached, and she was now working on the final decorative elements. You do fine work, he admitted, running a finger along a completed seam. Better than I could have managed. High praise coming from a man who's been repairing saddles since before he could properly shave, she teased, echoing his earlier words. Quincy found himself smiling despite his usual reserve. I might have exaggerated my skills slightly. I never would have guessed, Willa replied with mock seriousness, her blue eyes twinkling with humor. She tied off the final stitch and held up the saddle for inspection. There. That should hold you for another few thousand miles. The transformation was remarkable. Not only had she repaired the damage, but she'd restored the saddle to something close to its original glory. The leather gleamed with a polish she'd applied, and the stitching was tight and even. It looked better than it had in years. This is exceptional work, Quincy said, genuinely impressed. You've added years to its life, Willa nodded, satisfaction evident in her expression. Good craftsmanship deserves respect. Your father would be pleased, I think. Quincy swallowed past an unexpected tightness in his throat. Yes, he would. He reached for his money pouch. I insist on paying you for this. It's far beyond a simple favor. Willa began packing away her tools. If you're determined to pay me, I could use a riding companion to Eagle Pass. I've heard there are Blackfoot braves causing trouble on the North Road. Quincy hesitated. He preferred traveling alone, setting his own pace without having to consider another person's needs. But Willa had spent hours repairing his saddle, saving him both time and money. And they were headed to the same destination anyway. I'd planned to leave at first light, he said finally. Perfect, Willa replied, closing her tool kit with a snap. I'll be ready. As she stood to return her supplies to her wagon, Quincy found himself watching her with newfound interest. There was something about Willa Everhart, a blend of competence, directness, and quiet strength that was unlike any woman he'd encountered before. It was intriguing, and that, he reminded himself firmly, was dangerous territory indeed. Willa was a widow heading to her brother's ranch, and he was a drifter with no interest in putting down roots. Their paths had crossed briefly, and soon they would diverge again. Best to remember that, regardless of how skillfully she'd repaired his saddle or how unexpectedly he'd enjoyed her company. Dawn broke crisp and clear over Rattlesnake Gulch, painting the sky in streaks of gold and pink. Quincy was already awake, having spent a restless night on a lumpy mattress at the town's only hotel. He dreamt of Violet, as he sometimes still did, but the dream had shifted strangely, her face blurring and changing into Willa's. He'd woken feeling unsettled, reminding himself forcefully that he'd sworn off entanglements with women years ago. He saddled Copper, pleased with how perfectly his repaired saddle fit. After checking his supplies and weapons, he led the horse toward the edge of town where he'd agreed to meet Willa. Part of him half expected her not to show. Women, in his experience, were rarely punctual, but she was already there, her wagon loaded and her mare harnessed. "Morning," she greeted him, looking fresh and alert despite the early hour. She wore the same practical outfit as yesterday, with the addition of a leather vest and a rifle resting across the wagon seat beside her. "Sleep well." "Well enough," Quincy replied, swinging into his saddle. "It's about a 3-day ride to Eagle Pass if the weather holds. The wagon will slow us some." "I've made good time with it so far," Willa said. "Maple here is stronger than she looks." She patted the bay mare's neck affectionately. "We'll keep up." Quincy nodded and turned Copper toward the north road. They rode in companionable silence as the town fell away behind them, the landscape opening into rolling grasslands dotted with clusters of pine and aspen. The morning air was cool, carrying the scent of sage and wildflowers. After an hour, Willa spoke. "The marshal mentioned there's been trouble with Blackfoot warriors recently. Have you had any run-ins with them?" "Not lately," Quincy replied. "But it pays to be cautious. Their hunting grounds have been increasingly encroached upon by settlers, and the railroad makes for bad blood. My brother wrote that they've been more aggressive since the government started forcing them onto reservations," Willa said. "Can't say I blame them. I wouldn't take kindly to being pushed off my land either." Quincy glanced at her, surprised by her perspective. Most settlers he'd encountered viewed Indians as obstacles to progress at best, savage threats at worst. "That's a generous view for a white woman heading to ranching country," Willa shrugged. "My husband traded fairly with the Blackfoot, said they were good people if treated with respect." She adjusted her hat against the rising sun. "Besides, I know what it's like to lose everything you've built, makes you understand why people fight back." Her comment sparked Quincy's curiosity. "You lost everything?" Willa's expression tightened slightly. "After Thomas died, his partner claimed the ranch belonged solely to him, said Thomas had signed it over as collateral for a loan." Her hands tightened on the reins. "I knew it was a lie. Thomas would never have done that without telling me, but the papers looked genuine. With no family nearby and a corrupt local judge, I had no recourse." "So you left," Quincy supplied. "Not immediately," Willa said, a hint of steel entering her voice. "I challenged Miles, that was his name, to produce the loan agreement. He couldn't, of course, because it never existed. But by then, he'd hired men to escort me off the property." She paused, a small, grim smile touching her lips. "I left, but not before ensuring he understood the cost of his treachery." Quincy raised an eyebrow, meaning. "Let's just say his new saddles and harnesses developed unexpected problems at inopportune moments." Willa's blue eyes flashed with vindication. "Amazing how quickly a man can be thrown from a horse when his cinch suddenly gives way." Despite himself, Quincy laughed. "Remind me never to cross you, Mrs. Everhart." "Just Willa," she corrected. "And I only enact revenge on those who truly deserve it, Mr. Xavier." "Quincy," he replied automatically, still amused by her admission. He'd encountered many types of women in his travels: delicate southern belles, hardened prostitutes, stoic farm wives, but Willa Everhart defied easy categorization. She had the refined speech of an Easterner, but the practical grit of a frontier woman, combined with a spirit that was entirely her own. They continued their journey, the conversation flowing more easily than Quincy would have expected. Willa asked intelligent questions about the territory, listening attentively to his answers without the fearful or dramatic reactions he'd come to expect from female travelers. In turn, he found himself curious about her life in Boston and her experiences out west. By midday, when they stopped to rest the horses beside a small creek, Quincy realized with some surprise that he was enjoying her company. There was something refreshing about Willa's directness and self-sufficiency. She didn't simper or flirt, nor did she demand special treatment because of her sex. As they prepared to continue their journey, Quincy noticed dark clouds gathering on the western horizon. "Storm's coming," he observed. "We should make for the old trapper's cabin about 5 miles ahead. It's not much, but it's shelter." Willa nodded, following his gaze to the threatening sky. "Will we make it before the rain hits?" "If we push the pace," Quincy replied, already swinging back into his saddle. They made good time despite the wagon, but the storm moved faster. The wind picked up, bending the tall grass in waves, and the first heavy raindrops began to fall when the cabin was still a mile distant. By the time they reached the dilapidated structure, they were both soaked through, and thunder was crashing overhead. The cabin was little more than 4 walls and a roof, abandoned years ago when the fur trade had declined. Quincy dismounted quickly and led Copper around to the lean-to at the back, which would offer some shelter for the animals. Willa followed with her mare and wagon. "We'll need to unharness Maple," Quincy shouted over the downpour. "Get her under cover." Together they worked quickly, removing the harness and leading both horses into the cramped shelter. Once the animals were settled, they grabbed essential supplies from the wagon and made a dash for the cabin's entrance. Inside, the air was musty and damp, but the roof appeared to be mostly intact. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and crude shelves held dusty jars and forgotten trapping supplies. A rough wooden table with one broken leg leaned against the wall, and a rope bed with a rotted mattress occupied one corner. "Homey," Willa commented wryly, wringing water from her skirt. Quincy smiled despite himself. "I've stayed in worse." He set to work immediately, checking the chimney for blockages before gathering the driest wood he could find from a pile near the fireplace. Willa, without being asked, began clearing debris from the floor and arranging their supplies. Soon a small fire was crackling in the hearth, pushing back the chill and dampness. Outside, the storm raged, rain pounding on the roof and wind howling through gaps in the walls. Willa spread their wet outer garments near the fire to dry and produced jerky and hardtack from her supplies. "Not exactly a feast," she said, offering Quincy a portion, "but it'll keep us going." Quincy accepted gratefully. As they ate in silence, he found himself studying Willa in the firelight. With her hat removed, her brown hair fell in damp waves past her shoulders, making her look younger and somehow more vulnerable. The firelight cast shifting shadows across her features, highlighting the delicate curve of her jaw and the thoughtful intelligence in her eyes. He looked away quickly when she caught him staring. "Storm might last through the night," he said gruffly, focusing on the fire. "We've lost half a day's travel." "Could be worse," Willa replied pragmatically. "We have shelter, food, and dry wood. Many travelers would consider us fortunate." Quincy nodded, appreciating her lack of complaint. Most women of his acquaintance would have been bemoaning their ruined clothes or the primitive accommodations. As the evening wore on, they talked easily, sharing stories of their travels. Quincy found himself recounting adventures he hadn't spoken of in years: a near miss with a grizzly in Wyoming, a blizzard that had trapped him in a mining camp for 3 weeks, a horse race he'd won against a Cheyenne brave that had earned him unexpected friendship rather than enmity. In turn, Willa told him of her journey west as a new bride, her voice softening when she spoke of Thomas and their dreams of building a successful ranch. She described Boston with a mixture of fondness and detachment, as if acknowledging a place she could never return to. "Do you miss it?" Quincy asked. "The city, I mean," Willa considered the question. "I miss certain comforts: hot baths, bookstores, reliable mail service." She smiled slightly. "But I don't miss the constraints. Out here, a woman can be judged by her actions rather than solely by her adherence to social expectations. There's freedom in that, despite the hardships." Quincy understood. He'd grown up in St. Louis, where his father had worked as a clerk after giving up farming. The city had always felt confining to him, with its rigid social hierarchies and endless rules. The West, for all its dangers, offered a chance to be measured by one's own merits. "What about your family?" he asked. "Besides your brother in Eagle Pass." A shadow crossed Willa's face. "My parents died within months of each other just before I met Thomas. My other brothers scattered, two to California during the gold rush, one to Oregon, another back east to pursue medicine. Robert is the only one I've maintained regular contact with." She poked at the fire with a stick. "What about you? Any family left?" Quincy shook his head. "Father died 10 years ago. Mother," he hesitated, the old bitterness rising. "She left when I was 10, ran off with a traveling salesman, never heard from her again." "I'm sorry," Willa said softly. "That must have been hard on a young boy." "Made me who I am," Quincy replied with a shrug that didn't quite disguise the lingering hurt. "Taught me early that women can't be counted on." "And Violet reinforced the lesson," Willa observed. "She did." Quincy stared into the fire, memories surfacing despite his efforts to suppress them. "I should have seen it coming. She was always talking about the things she wanted: a fine house in town, fancy dresses, a carriage. I was saving for land, planning to build us a place of our own, but it wasn't happening fast enough for her." "Some people are never satisfied with what they have," Willa said. "They're always looking to the horizon, convinced happiness lies just beyond what they can see." "Speaking from experience?" Quincy asked, noting something in her tone. Willa smiled ruefully. "Thomas was a dreamer. Always planning the next improvement, the next expansion. 'Once we've done this, Willa, everything will be perfect,' he'd say. I loved his optimism, but sometimes I wished he could see that what we already had was enough." Her expression softened with memory. "He was a good man, though, kind, honest." "He would have been devastated by Miles's betrayal." "How did you end up partners with Miles in the first place?" Quincy asked. Thomas needed capital to expand. Miles had money from a lucky strike in a silver mine. Willa's expression darkened. "He seemed genuine at first. After Thomas died, he was all sympathy and support. Then once the funeral was over, he changed completely. Claimed Thomas had made him sole owner if anything happened to him. No will to contradict him. Our cabin burned shortly after Thomas died, supposedly an accident." Willa's tone made it clear she believed otherwise. "Any papers we had were lost. It was his word against mine, and in that county, a man's word carried more weight than a widow's." Quincy felt a surge of anger on her behalf. "Sounds like Miles deserved worse than a few faulty saddles." "Probably," Willa agreed. "But vengeance only carries you so far. Eventually, you have to decide whether to keep looking back or move forward." Her words resonated uncomfortably with Quincy. Hadn't he been looking back for 5 years, letting Violet's betrayal and his mother's abandonment dictate his interaction with every woman he met? The thought made him uneasy. The storm continued through the night, forcing them to share the small cabin. Quincy insisted Willa take the rope bed, despite its sorry state, while he made do with his bedroll near the fire. He lay awake longer than usual, listening to the rain and the occasional rumble of thunder, acutely aware of Willa's presence across the room. For the first time in years, he found himself wondering what it might be like to have a permanent companion, someone to share the trail with, someone whose company eased rather than grated on his solitude. It was a dangerous line of thinking, and Quincy firmly redirected his thoughts to the journey ahead, and the job waiting in Eagle Pass. Morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having passed during the night. They set out early, the washed landscape vibrant with color and teeming with life. Birds called from trees heavy with moisture, and wildflowers seemed to have sprung up overnight, dotting the prairie with splashes of yellow and purple. Their second day of travel passed pleasantly. The trail was muddy in places, slowing their progress, but the clear weather and spectacular views compensated for the delay. Quincy found himself pointing out landmarks to Willa, sharing knowledge of the territory he'd acquired over years of traveling these routes. By late afternoon, they had reached the foothills that marked the approach to Eagle Pass. They made camp beside a small tributary of the Missouri River, setting up beneath a stand of cottonwoods that offered shelter from the light breeze. As Quincy tended to the horses, he noticed Willa examining his saddle, running her fingers along the repairs she'd made. "Holding up well?" she asked when she saw him watching. Perfectly, he replied. Your stitching is solid as iron. Willa smiled, a flash of pride crossing her features. When we reach Eagle Pass, I'm thinking of setting up a harness and saddle repair shop. Robert says the nearest one is 30 miles away in Clearwater. You do well, Quincy said honestly. Quality leatherwork is hard to find in these parts. That's what I'm counting on. Willa glanced toward the distant mountains. I need to build something of my own again, something no one can take from me. Quincy understood the sentiment. He'd kept his own possessions minimal for years, partly for ease of travel, but also because owning little meant risking little. You ever think about settling down? Willa asked, the question catching him off guard. Finding a place to call your own instead of always moving on, Quincy busied himself adjusting Copper's saddle blanket. Not much, I'm suited to the trail. Are you? Willa's gaze was steady. Or is it just safer than risking disappointment again? Her directness was both irritating and oddly refreshing. Most people didn't challenge him so openly. Moving around keeps things simple, he replied after a moment. No attachments, no expectations, no one to answer to but myself. And no one to count on but yourself either, Willa observed quietly. The comment struck closer to home than Quincy was comfortable with. He'd built his life around self-reliance, priding himself on needing no one. But sometimes, in the deep quiet of night camps or during long stretches of empty trail, the solitude weighed on him in ways he rarely acknowledged. Before he could formulate a response, a flicker of movement on a distant ridge caught his attention. He raised a hand, signaling Willa to silence, and reached slowly for the rifle on his saddle. What is it? She whispered, immediately alert. Riders on the ridge, Quincy murmured. Could be nothing, could be trouble. Willa followed his gaze, her body tensing. Blackfoot, maybe. Quincy counted at least 4 figures silhouetted against the sky. Or it could be ranchers. Hard to tell at this distance. They watched as the riders conferred briefly, then began descending toward the valley where Quincy and Willa had made camp. Their approach wasn't particularly stealthy, which could either be reassuring or concerning. Stay near the wagon, Quincy instructed, lifting his rifle. Be ready to move if necessary. Willa nodded, retrieving her own rifle from the wagon seat. She checked it methodically, her movements calm and practiced. Again, Quincy was impressed by her composure. Most women in this situation would be showing signs of fear. As the riders drew nearer, their identity became clearer. 4 men, white, dressed in the typical attire of ranch hands or cowboys. Something about their demeanor put Quincy on edge. They rode with a casual confidence that bordered on arrogance, spread out in a formation that suggested they were accustomed to intimidating others. Afternoon, the lead rider called as they approached the camp. He was a weathered man in his 40s with a thick mustache and cold eyes that assessed Quincy and Willa calculatingly. Fine day for traveling. It is, Quincy agreed neutrally, his rifle held casually but ready. Something we can help you with, just being neighborly, the man replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. These parts can be dangerous for folks traveling alone, Indians causing trouble lately. His gaze shifted to Willa, lingering in a way that made Quincy's jaw tighten. Especially for a lady. We're managing fine, Quincy said firmly. Appreciate your concern, the rider's smile widened. Heading to Eagle Pass, I'd wager, not many other settlements in this direction. He nodded toward their supplies. You folks look well provisioned, lucky for you. Food's scarce around here lately. The implication was clear, and Quincy's grip tightened on his rifle. These men weren't here to offer protection, they were sizing up potential targets. We have what we need for ourselves, Quincy replied evenly. No surplus to share, I'm afraid. One of the other riders, a younger man with a pockmarked face, spat on the ground. Ain't very Christian, refusing to help fellow travelers. Seems to me true Christians wouldn't press strangers for their supplies, Willa interjected, her voice calm but firm. She'd moved closer to Quincy, her own rifle held ready but not threatening. The leader's eyes narrowed slightly at her response. You got quite a tongue on you, madam. Your husband ought to teach you when to speak and when to stay quiet. We're not married, Willa replied coolly. And I speak when I have something worth saying. Tension crackled in the air. The 4 men exchanged glances, a silent communication that confirmed Quincy's suspicions. They were deciding whether to press their advantage 4 against 2 with a wagon full of supplies as potential reward. 4 against 2 are poor odds, Quincy said quietly, making it clear he understood their intentions. Especially when both of us are armed and know how to use what we're holding. He met the leader's gaze steadily. I've got no quarrel with you boys, and I'd prefer to keep it that way. For a long moment, the leader seemed to be weighing his options. Finally, he shrugged, affecting nonchalance. No need to get prickly, friend, just making conversation. He touched the brim of his hat. You folks enjoy your evening. Roads to Eagle Pass can be tricky after dark, best to stay alert. The warning was thinly veiled, but Quincy merely nodded. We always do. With a final assessing look, the riders turned their horses and moved away, heading back toward the ridge they'd appeared from. Quincy and Willa remained tense until they were well out of sight. You think they'll come back? Willa asked quietly, still holding her rifle ready. Possibly, Quincy replied grimly. Depends how desperate they are. He surveyed their exposed position with a critical eye. We should move camp, find somewhere more defensible for the night. Willa nodded and immediately began gathering their belongings. Within minutes, they had loaded the wagon and doused their small fire. Quincy led them to a more sheltered location nearly a mile away, a rocky outcropping that provided cover on 3 sides and offered a clear view of the surrounding terrain. As they set up their new camp, Willa moved with efficient practicality, asking no unnecessary questions and offering no complaints about the disruption. Quincy found himself appreciating her adaptability more with each passing hour. You handled yourself well back there, he commented as they finished securing the horses in a natural enclosure formed by the rocks. Willa shrugged. Not my first encounter with men who mistake politeness for weakness. She checked her rifle again, a habit Quincy had noticed. Thomas taught me to shoot before we left Boston, said a woman out west needed to protect herself. He was right, Quincy agreed, though you seem capable of that without much help. A small smile touched Willa's lips. I've had practice. She settled against a rock, her rifle across her lap. So what's our plan? Take turns keeping watch, Quincy nodded, impressed again by her practical approach. I'll take first shift, you get some rest. Wake me for the second, she insisted. You need sleep too. Quincy wanted to argue but recognized the logic in her words. I will, he promised, settling into a position that gave him a clear view of the approach to their camp. The night passed uneventfully, with no sign of the 4 riders. When Quincy woke Willa for her shift, she transitioned from sleep to alertness with a speed that spoke of previous experience keeping watch. Again, he found himself wondering about the challenges she'd faced in the years since her husband's death. By morning, they were both tired but ready to complete the final leg of their journey to Eagle Pass. As they packed up camp, Quincy found himself strangely reluctant to reach their destination. Once they arrived, their paths would diverge. He to deliver his message to Johnson, she to her brother's ranch. The realization bothered him more than it should have. We should reach Eagle Pass by midday, he said as they set out. Your brother expecting you. Willa nodded, guiding her mare carefully along the rocky trail. I sent a letter from Rattlesnake Gulch. Whether it arrived ahead of us is another matter entirely. If not, you're welcome to stay at the hotel until you can make contact, Quincy offered. I'll be there at least overnight while I wait for Johnson's response to the message I'm carrying. Thank you, Willa replied with a smile that warmed her blue eyes. Though knowing Robert, he's probably been watching the trail for days. He can be overprotective. Understandable, Quincy said. The territories aren't always kind to women on their own. No, Willa agreed, but they're not always kind to men either. She glanced at him. Loneliness doesn't discriminate by gender, I've found. Quincy had no response to that. It was true that his solitary existence, while freely chosen, carried its own hardships. There were times when the isolation of the trail weighed heavily, when he found himself craving conversation or simple human connection. Eagle Pass came into view just before noon, a small but growing settlement nestled in a valley between 2 mountain ranges. A cluster of wooden buildings lined the main street, with homesteads and ranches dotting the surrounding landscape. It was larger than Quincy had expected, a a sign that the territory was developing rapidly. As they approached the town limits, a rider came galloping toward them. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, with the same brown hair and strong features as Willa. Even at a distance, the family resemblance was unmistakable. "Robert," Willa called, her face lighting up with genuine joy. Her brother reined in his horse beside the wagon, dismounting in a fluid motion and striding forward to embrace Willa as she climbed down to meet him. "About time you showed up," he said gruffly, though his tight embrace belied the casual words. "Was beginning to think you'd changed your mind. And missed the chance to boss you around like when we were children?" "Never," Willa teased, stepping back to study her brother. "You look well. Ranch life agrees with you." Robert Everhart turned his attention to Quincy, who had remained mounted, giving the siblings space for their reunion. "This your traveling companion, Quincy Xavier," Quincy introduced himself, extending a hand. "We met in Rattlesnake Gulch and discovered we were headed in the same direction." Robert shook his hand firmly, his gaze assessing. "Appreciate you escorting my sister safely. These trails can be dangerous." "Your sister is quite capable of handling herself," Quincy replied honestly. "She's a fine shot and keeps a cool head in difficult situations." Robert's eyebrows rose slightly, and he glanced at Willa with a mixture of surprise and pride. "That's so? Well, she always was the most level-headed of the Everhart brood." He turned back to Quincy. "What brings you to Eagle Pass, Mr. Xavier?" "Business with Abraham Johnson at Crescent Moon Ranch," Quincy replied, noting how Robert's expression immediately cooled. "Johnson," Robert repeated flatly. "Well, that's unfortunate timing. Things with Johnson have gotten worse lately. He's been diverting water from the creek that borders our properties, leaving my southern pastures dry." "Robert," Willa said warningly, "Mr. Xavier is simply delivering a message. Don't put him in the middle of your dispute." Robert had the grace to look slightly abashed. "Of course." "No offense intended, Xavier. Johnson and I have history, that's all." "None taken," Quincy assured him. "I'm just the messenger." "Well, the least I can do is offer you a hot meal before you face Johnson," Robert said, his hospitality apparently overriding his animosity toward Quincy's client. "Willa's things can be brought to the ranch later. My foreman's in town with the wagon." Quincy hesitated, glancing at Willa. Their journey together had reached its natural conclusion, and he had a job to complete. Yet he found himself strangely reluctant to say goodbye so abruptly. "That's kind of you," he said finally. "But I should deliver my message first. Johnson is expecting it." "Of course," Robert replied, though he looked disappointed. "Perhaps dinner then, once your business is concluded." Before Quincy could respond, Willa interjected, "We'd be delighted, wouldn't we, Quincy? After all, I still need to check that my saddle repairs have held up after another day's riding." Her blue eyes met his, conveying a message he couldn't quite decipher. "I suppose I could spare time for dinner," Quincy agreed, finding it surprisingly easy to delay his usual hasty departure. "Excellent," Robert said. "Diamondback Ranch just north of town. Can't miss it, big arch with a diamondback rattler worked into the ironwork." He turned to Willa. "Ready to see your new home, sister?" "In a moment," Willa replied. "I'd like a quick word with Mr. Xavier first. Ranch business." She glanced meaningfully at her brother. Robert looked between them curiously but nodded. "I'll wait by the general store." "Don't be long. Beth's been cooking all morning in anticipation of your arrival." Once Robert had ridden a discreet distance away, Willa approached Quincy, who remained on horseback. "You should know what you're walking into with Johnson," she said quietly. According to Robert's letters, he's become increasingly erratic lately, drinking heavily, making wild accusations, threatening neighbors. Quincy frowned. "The message I'm carrying might explain some of that. His brother in St. Louis wants him to sell the ranch and return east. Family concerns." "Ah," Willa nodded thoughtfully. "That would account for his behavior. He's probably feeling cornered." She hesitated. "Be careful, Quincy. A desperate man is unpredictable." Her concern touched him unexpectedly. "I've delivered bad news before," he assured her. "I'll be fine." "I'm sure you will," Willa replied with a small smile. "Still, I'd prefer to see you in one piece at dinner. The repairs to your saddle come with a guarantee. After all, I need to ensure my work is holding up." Quincy found himself smiling in return. I wouldn't dream of depriving you of the chance to inspect your handiwork." A moment of silence stretched between them, filled with things neither seemed ready to articulate. Finally, Willa stepped back. "Until dinner then, Mr. Xavier." "Until dinner, Mrs. Everhart," he replied, tipping his hat. As he rode toward the Crescent Moon Ranch, following directions provided by a townsperson, Quincy reflected on the unexpected turn his simple messenger job had taken. 4 days ago, he'd been a solitary rider with a damaged saddle and a deep-seated distrust of women. Now, he found himself looking forward to dinner with Willa and her brother and questioning assumptions that had guided his life for years. The Crescent Moon Ranch was impressive, a large, well-maintained property with substantial herds and numerous outbuildings. The main house was larger than Quincy had expected, suggesting that Abraham Johnson had done well for himself in the territories. A ranch hand directed Quincy to the house, where he was met by Johnson himself, a tall, gaunt man whose bloodshot eyes and trembling hands confirmed Willa's warning about his drinking. Johnson led Quincy to a cluttered office and accepted the sealed letter from St. Louis with obvious trepidation. As Johnson read, his face darkened. "My brother wants me to sell," he said flatly, confirming what Quincy already suspected. "Says our mother is ailing and needs both her sons near." He crumpled the letter in his fist. "Damn him, I've built something here, something that matters." "Your brother mentioned compensation," Quincy said carefully. "He's willing to buy your share at a fair price." Johnson laughed bitterly. "Fair price? What's a fair price for 10 years of sweat and blood?" He moved to a cabinet and poured himself a generous measure of whiskey. "And who would buy?" "Land values have dropped since the drought began." "There might be interested parties locally," Quincy suggested, thinking of Robert Everhart's complaints about water access. Perhaps buying Johnson's land would resolve the dispute. Like Everhart, Johnson's eyes narrowed. "That bastard's been trying to force me out for months, accusing me of stealing water when I'm just protecting what's rightfully mine." He drained his glass and refilled it immediately. "He'd love to get his hands on my property, probably sent you to spy on me." "I've never met Everhart before today," Quincy said truthfully. "I'm just delivering your brother's message as hired." Johnson studied him suspiciously, then seemed to deflate. "Well, you've delivered it. I'll need time to consider my response." He pulled a small pouch from a drawer and tossed it to Quincy. "Your payment as agreed. If you're waiting for a reply, I'll have it ready tomorrow." Quincy pocketed the payment with a nod. "I'll be at the hotel in town." As he rode back toward Eagle Pass, Quincy considered the situation. Johnson was clearly unstable, his judgment compromised by alcohol and paranoia. The dispute with Robert Everhart had escalated beyond a simple disagreement over water rights. Quincy had seen such conflicts before; they rarely ended well without intervention. He found himself thinking of Willa, preparing to build a new life in the midst of this brewing storm. The thought troubled him more than it should have for a woman he'd known only a few days. The town hotel was modest but clean, offering Quincy a much-needed bath and a chance to change into his spare clothes before dinner at the Everhart Ranch. As he dressed, he caught himself taking unusual care with his appearance, and Riley acknowledged the reason: a pair of perceptive blue eyes that seemed to see through his carefully constructed defenses. The Diamondback Ranch was indeed marked by an impressive iron arch, just as Robert had described. The property was smaller than Johnson's but well-maintained, with neat fences and healthy livestock. The main house was a substantial 2-story structure with a wide porch and recently painted shutters. Quincy was greeted warmly by Robert and introduced to his wife, Beth, a friendly woman with a quick smile who immediately made him feel welcome. Their 2 young sons, aged 8 and 10, regarded him with open curiosity, peppering him with questions about his travels until their mother shooed them away to wash for dinner. Willa emerged from an adjoining room, and Quincy felt an unexpected leap in his pulse at the sight of her. She'd changed from her traveling clothes into a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes. Her hair was arranged more neatly than he'd seen it before, though a few stubborn tendrils still escaped confinement. "Mr. Xavier," she greeted him with a smile. "I trust your business with Johnson went smoothly." As smoothly as could be expected, Quincy replied, conscious of Robert's interest in their conversation. He'll have a reply for me tomorrow. Dinner was a lively affair, with Robert and Beth's boys providing most of the entertainment with their energetic recounting of ranch adventures. Willa fit seamlessly into the family dynamic, teasing her nephews and engaging Beth in conversations about the household and community. Watching her, Quincy was struck by how naturally she belonged here, among family. Yet there was a self-containment about her that suggested she'd learned to be comfortable on her own as well. It was a quality he recognized and respected. After the meal, Robert invited Quincy to join him for a glass of whiskey on the porch while Beth and Willa cleared the table, firmly refusing Quincy's offer to help. Outside, the evening was pleasant, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of pine from the nearby hills. "So," Robert said after they'd settled into chairs, "how exactly did you and my sister become traveling companions?" Quincy took a sip of his whiskey before answering. "My saddle was damaged. She offered to repair it, insisted, actually. She's remarkably skilled with leather." Robert nodded. "Always was, even as a girl. Our father despaired of ever making a proper lady of her." He smiled fondly. "Not that he tried very hard, he was too proud of her talents." "She mentioned his harness shop in Boston," Quincy said. "Best in the city," Robert confirmed. "Would have been Willa's if she'd been born male." He shook his head at the injustice. "She was better with leather than any of us boys, but customers wanted to deal with men, not women." "Their loss," Quincy commented. "Her work on my saddle was exceptional." Robert studied him over the rim of his glass. "She said you protected her from some troublemakers on the trail." "We protected each other," Quincy corrected. "Your sister is remarkably self-sufficient." "She's had to be," Robert said, a shadow crossing his face. "After what happened with Thomas and that bastard Miles." He trailed off, apparently realizing he might be sharing more than Willa had. "She told me some of it," Quincy assured him. "About losing the ranch," Robert's expression darkened. "What she probably didn't tell you was that Miles threatened her when she challenged him, physically threatened her, if not for a neighbor intervening." He took a deep drink of whiskey. "When I found out, I wanted to ride up there and deal with him personally. Willa wouldn't let me. Said she'd handled it her way. She mentioned something about saddles developing unexpected problems," Quincy said with a slight smile. Robert laughed. "That sounds like Willa. Subtle but effective revenge." He set down his glass. "She's the strongest person I know, Mr. Xavier. But she's had more than her share of hardship. She's fortunate to have family who cares for her," Quincy observed. "And she'll have a home here for as long as she wants," Robert said firmly, "though I suspect Willa will insist on making her own way. She mentioned setting up a saddle and harness shop in town." "She'd do well," Quincy agreed. "From what I've seen, there's plenty of need for quality leatherwork in these parts." Robert nodded. "That's what I told her. In fact, I've already spoken to Tom Miller about the vacant shop next to his smithy. It's small, but it has living quarters above and good light for detailed work." He glanced at Quincy. "What about you, Xavier? What are your plans after you deliver Johnson's reply to his brother?" The question caught Quincy off guard. He'd been so focused on the current job that he hadn't given much thought to what would come next. Typically, he'd head to St. Louis to report to Johnson's brother, then pick up another commission, perhaps escorting a wealthy traveler or delivering another sensitive message. The endless cycle of movement that had defined his life for years. But for the first time in a long while, the prospect didn't hold its usual appeal. The thought of riding away from Eagle Pass from Willa left him oddly unsettled. "I haven't decided," he admitted finally. "I usually follow the work. Plenty of work around here for a man with your skills," Robert suggested casually. "Eagle Pass is growing. The stage line's looking for reliable guards. The marshal sometimes needs deputies. Or if you prefer something more settled, there's good land still available for homesteading." Quincy was saved from responding by the appearance of Willa at the door. "Are you men solving all the world's problems out here?" she asked lightly. "Just discussing business opportunities in Eagle Pass," Robert replied with a meaningful glance at Quincy. "Our friend here might be in the market for a change of scenery." Willa's eyebrows rose slightly. "Is that so?" I thought you preferred the open trail to settling down, Mr. Xavier. I've found my perspectives changing lately, Quincy replied, meeting her gaze steadily. A flush of color touched Willa's cheeks. Well, she said, recovering quickly, I was coming to ask if you'd like to see the workshop Robert has been telling me about. It's not far and there's still daylight left. I'd like that, Quincy said, rising from his chair. Robert watched them with barely concealed interest. Take the bay gelding in the corral, Willa. He needs the exercise. Minutes later, they were riding side by side toward town, the evening sun casting long shadows across the land. Willa guided them confidently, clearly already familiar with the route despite having arrived only hours earlier. Your brother seems determined to keep you in Eagle Pass, Quincy observed. Willa smiled. Robert has been trying to get me to join him here since Thomas died. He worries about me. With good reason, from what he's told me, Quincy replied. He mentioned Miles threatened you. Willa's expression tightened. Robert talks too much. Yes, there was an unpleasant confrontation, nothing I couldn't handle. By sabotaging his saddles, Quincy asked with a hint of amusement. Among other things, Willa admitted. His stirrup leather snapped during a cattle drive. Left him on foot 10 miles from the ranch, and his best bridle mysteriously fell apart during a horse race he'd bet heavily on. Her eyes gleamed with vindication. Small recompense for stealing a ranch, but satisfying nonetheless. Quincy chuckled despite himself. Remind me never to cross you, Mrs. Everhart. You already promised that once, she replied with a smile. And it's Willa, remember? They reached the edge of town and dismounted outside a small building next to the blacksmith's. The shop was simple but sturdy, with large windows that would indeed provide excellent light for detailed work. A faded sign above the door read Hanson's Dry Goods, though it was clear the business had been closed for some time. It needs work, Willa said, peering through a dusty window. But the structure is sound and the location is perfect. Ranchers and travelers would pass right by. You seem to have it all figured out, Quincy observed. Willa turned to face him, her expression suddenly serious. Not everything, she said quietly. There are still uncertainties. Something in her tone made Quincy's pulse quicken. They stood close, the evening shadows gathering around them, the bustle of the small town seeming distant despite being mere yards away. Like what? He asked, his voice lower than he'd intended. Willa hesitated, then met his gaze directly. Like whether a man who prefers the open trail might consider reasons to stay in one place, or whether the risk of disappointment is worth the potential reward. Quincy felt as if the ground had shifted beneath him. In 4 days, this woman had challenged every assumption he'd built his life around, every defense he'd erected against connection and vulnerability. And instead of running, as every instinct urged, he found himself wanting to move closer. I've been thinking about that, he admitted. About how a person can get so focused on avoiding past mistakes that they miss present opportunities. Willa's eyes softened. And have you reached any conclusions, Mr. Xavier? Quincy, he corrected gently. And yes, I believe I have. He took a deliberate step closer. I'm thinking Eagle Pass might be a good place to rest for a while, maybe even put down roots. Is that so? Willa's voice was barely above a whisper. And what would keep a drifter like you in one place? A saddle that needs regular maintenance, Quincy replied with a small smile. And the remarkable woman who repaired it. The distance between them vanished as Willa stepped forward, her hand reaching up to touch his face with a gentleness that made his chest ache. That's a significant change of direction for a man who thought women were nothing but trouble. Some women are worth the trouble, Quincy murmured before closing the final distance between them. The kiss was tentative at first, a cautious exploration. Then Willa's arms slipped around his neck, and hesitation gave way to certainty as Quincy pulled her closer. Years of loneliness and self-imposed isolation seemed to dissolve in the warmth of her embrace, replaced by a sense of rightness he hadn't known he was missing. When they finally separated, both slightly breathless, Willa's blue eyes were bright with emotion. You realize this complicates things, she said, though her smile belied any real concern. I'm discovering I don't mind complications nearly as much as I thought, Quincy replied, reluctantly stepping back when he heard approaching footsteps on the boardwalk. Besides, I believe I still owe you dinner in town. Tomorrow night after I finish with Johnson, I'd like that, Willa said, her smile warming him more effectively than any fire. Though I should warn you, Robert will be insufferably smug if he thinks his matchmaking is succeeding. Quincy laughed, feeling lighter than he had in years. I think I can bear it. As they mounted their horses to return to the Diamondback Ranch, the sun was setting behind the western mountains, painting the sky in brilliant hues of gold and crimson. Quincy found himself imagining more such sunsets, viewed from a permanent vantage point rather than from the trail. The thought no longer filled him with dread, but with a cautious hope. The next morning, Quincy rode to the Crescent Moon Ranch with a sense of purpose that went beyond simply completing a job. Johnson's response to his brother could potentially affect not just the feuding ranchers, but Willa's plans for her new beginning in Eagle Pass. A peaceful resolution to the water dispute would benefit everyone. Johnson was sober when Quincy arrived, though the deep shadows under his eyes suggested a sleepless night. He handed over a sealed letter without comment, then surprised Quincy by asking, "You staying in these parts, Xavier?" "I'm considering it," Quincy replied honestly. Johnson nodded wearily. "Tell Everhart I'm willing to discuss terms." When Quincy raised an eyebrow questioningly, Johnson continued, "For the ranch, if I'm going back east, might as well sell to someone who knows the land. Even if he is a stubborn jackass." "I'll pass that along," Quincy promised, a sense of unexpected optimism rising. Perhaps things could be resolved without further conflict after all. As he rode back toward town, Quincy found his thoughts turning to practical matters: where he might stay if he remained in Eagle Pass, what work he might pursue. The stage line Robert had mentioned was a possibility, at least initially. It would provide steady income while allowing him time to explore other options. For the first time in years, Quincy allowed himself to imagine a future that included permanence, a home, community connections, perhaps eventually a family. The thought, once terrifying, now filled him with a quiet anticipation. All because a headstrong woman had fixed his saddle without asking. That evening, as promised, Quincy escorted Willa to dinner at the town's small but respectable restaurant. They talked for hours, sharing stories and discovering the many ways their lives had paralleled despite vastly different circumstances. Both had experienced profound loss. Both had learned self-reliance out of necessity, and both had built walls to protect themselves from further hurt. "The difference," Willa observed as they walked back toward her brother's wagon afterward, "is that I always knew I wanted to rebuild something permanent. You convinced yourself you preferred drifting." Quincy nodded, acknowledging the truth in her words. "It seemed safer than risking another disappointment." "And now?" Willa asked, her hand warm in his as they walked beneath the star-filled sky. "Now I'm thinking some risks are worth taking," Quincy replied, drawing her to a stop beneath a cottonwood tree at the edge of town. "Like asking a remarkable woman if she might consider letting me court her properly, even though we've known each other less than a week." Willa's smile was luminous in the moonlight. "I believe that woman would consider it, Mr. Xavier. Provided you understand she comes with her own plans and aspirations." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Quincy assured her, drawing her closer. "Your independence is one of the things I admire most about you. Along with my saddle repair skills, of course," Willa teased. "Of course," Quincy agreed solemnly, before claiming her lips in a kiss that promised new beginnings for them both. In the weeks that followed, Eagle Pass witnessed several significant developments. Abraham Johnson sold his ranch to Robert Everhart, using the proceeds to return to St. Louis, where his mother's health was indeed failing. The water dispute was resolved, with Robert implementing a fair sharing system that benefited all neighboring properties. Willa opened her saddle and harness shop in the former dry goods store, quickly establishing a reputation for quality work that drew customers from as far as Clearwater. Living in the small apartment above her shop, she created a space that reflected her practical nature and creative spirit. Quincy took a position with the stage line, providing security for the increasingly frequent runs between Eagle Pass and larger settlements. The work allowed him to maintain some of the freedom he valued while establishing roots in the community. On days between stage runs, he often helped at Willa's shop, learning more about leatherwork under her patient tutelage. Their courtship progressed at a measured pace, both of them cautious from past experiences but increasingly certain of their feelings for each other. They were an unlikely pair, the drifter who'd sworn off attachments and the independent widow determined to rebuild on her own terms, yet somehow they balanced each other perfectly. 6 months after that fateful day in Rattlesnake Gulch, Quincy proposed. Not with flowery words or grand gestures, but with a simple truth offered as they sat together on the porch of her shop after closing. "I've spent most of my adult life running from connections," he told her, taking her hands in his. "Until a stubborn, brilliant woman fixed my saddle and, without my permission, started repairing something else I thought was beyond mending." He met her eyes steadily. "I love you, Willa Everhart, and if you'll have me, I'd like to build a life with you here or wherever your dreams take us." Willa's answer was equally straightforward. "I've been waiting for you to catch up to what I knew the day we met," she said with a tender smile. "Yes, Quincy Xavier, I'll marry you." They were wed that autumn in a simple ceremony attended by Robert's family and the friends they'd made in Eagle Pass. Willa wore a blue dress that matched her eyes, and Quincy wore a new suit purchased specifically for the occasion. His saddle, perfectly maintained and gleaming with Willa's care, was displayed prominently at the celebration, afterward a reminder of how their unlikely story began. In the years that followed, the leatherworking shop prospered, expanding to include a successful mail-order business for Willa's increasingly sought-after designs. Quincy eventually purchased a small ranch adjacent to Robert's property, where they built a comfortable home and raised 2 children, a son with his father's thoughtful nature, and a daughter who inherited her mother's skilled hands and independent spirit. And every year, on the anniversary of the day they met, Quincy would bring his saddle to Willa for a special inspection. She would run her fingers over the stitches she'd made that first day, both of them marveling at how a chance encounter and an unsolicited act of kindness had changed the course of their lives forever. "Best repair job ever done," Quincy would say, pulling her close. "The saddle's held up nicely too," Willa would reply with a smile, before kissing the man who'd once thought women were nothing but trouble until one fixed his saddle without asking.